Harvard, 12 days after Christmas 1969, a deep and troubling silence filled room 6B at 6 University Road, Cambridge. Donald Mitchell knew something was wrong when Jane Britton didn't come to their group study session. They were preparing for an important exam. By 9:25 in the morning, he knocked on her door. No one answered. The door was slightly open. What Mitchell saw inside shocked him, and he immediately ran to get help. When the Cambridge police came, they found Jane Britton, a 23-year-old Harvard student studying ancient cultures, had been murdered. She lay on the floor near her bed. She had been hit hard on the head. Her body was covered with a strange reddish-brown powder called red ochre, and an old clay piece rested on her chest. Her wallet was untouched. The door was unlocked and 2 windows were slightly open. There were no signs that someone had broken in, only a scary closeness and something that looked like a ceremony. The crime scene showed something more than just violence. It seemed almost planned, a symbolic arrangement that would puzzle Harvard for the next 50 years. Before we continue this shocking story, take a second to hit subscribe and like this video. Your support helps bring these forgotten stories to light, and it will make sure you don't miss any future uploads. For 50 years, the murder of Jane Britton haunted Harvard University and the Cambridge community. A brilliant life ended too soon. A family searching for answers that never came. Jane's death wasn't just a student's murder. It was the first crack showing deep problems within Harvard's walls, a scandal that officials desperately tried to hide, choosing reputation over truth. With Jane's father being an important person at Radcliffe and the university's weak security exposed, Harvard rushed to control the story. The truth, however complicated, was less important than protecting its reputation. Under heavy pressure, detectives weren't just chasing a killer. They were following an unspoken order: find someone to blame but not one of their own. That choice would let the real attacker disappear into the shadows for decades. Tiny biological clue lay waiting, the one piece of evidence that would one day solve everything. Harvard tried to protect. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below. I'm always interested to see how far these stories travel and how they connect us across distances. Today we'll revisit what happened in January 1969. We'll trace decades of unanswered questions, explore the pressures that shaped the investigation, and reveal the breakthrough that finally brought a complicated form of justice to Jane Britton. This is a story of loss, persistence, deception, and ultimately, justice delayed but perhaps never truly complete. Jane Marie Britton was born to Ruth and J. Boyd Britton on May 11, 1945, in Boston, Massachusetts. She was the oldest of 2 children. Jane and her younger brother, Boyd Britton Jr., grew up in a smart, well-respected family with a strong academic background. Her father, J. Boyd Britton, was a well-known professor and vice president of Radcliffe College, a women's school closely connected with Harvard University at the time. Her mother, Ruth Britton, was deeply involved in local academic and social causes, a well-known figure in Cambridge's smart circles. From an early age, Jane, to everyone who knew her, was described as brilliant, fiercely independent, and free-spirited. From elementary school, Jane showed an exceptional talent for history and languages, a passion that grew into a strong focus on archaeology. At a time when society still subtly pushed women towards more traditional roles, Jane had her sights set on uncovering the secrets of ancient civilizations. Her college thesis on Mesopotamian burial practices at Radcliffe College had already gotten attention, proof of her deep intelligence and strong determination. She didn't just study history, she lived it. Her brother, Boyd Jr., recalled in a 2015 interview, she had this incredible ability to make the past feel alive, to see patterns others missed. That's who Jane was, always digging deeper, always seeking the hidden truth. Jane graduated with highest honors from Radcliffe in 1967 and was accepted into Harvard University's top anthropology department, a dream come true for a rising star in Near Eastern archaeology. By 1969, she was a 23-year-old graduate student, close to completing her important general exams, the gateway to her doctoral research. Her professors consistently praised her work, particularly her insightful understandings of ancient texts and artifacts. She rented a room at 6 University Road, Cambridge, a charming but old building near campus owned by Harvard. It wasn't an official dorm, but rather a residence mainly housing anthropology graduate students. The ground floor entrance was often left open, a casual acceptance of a trusting community that would later be harshly criticized. Jane, like many others, often left her individual room door unlocked, or rather, her door couldn't be securely locked at all, as the latch had been broken long before she moved in. The building's overall security was poor. Windows and fire escapes offered easy access to upper floors, and maintenance problems went largely ignored. It was the 60s. Safety just wasn't something we talked much about, remembered Professor Alistair Finch, a senior faculty member who lived in the building at the time. Looking back, the locks were broken. The doors didn't always latch, and we all just assumed nothing bad could happen here on campus. Jane had developed a lively but complex social circle. She spent countless hours in the Peabody Museum, worked part-time cataloging recent finds, and was an active member of the Near East Archaeology Society. Her personal journal, later recovered from her room, revealed a young woman wrestling with intense academic pressure, complex romantic relationships, and a deep desire to forge her own path in a male-dominated field. January 6, 1969, the day before her murder, began like any other Monday for Jane. According to statements from classmates and professors, as well as her own journal entry from that morning, she attended her 9 a.m. seminar on Sumerian linguistics, followed by a demanding 11:30 a.m. meeting with her advisor, Professor C.C. Karl Lemberg-Karlovsky, to discuss her upcoming general exams. The meeting was tense. Karlovsky had recently failed her on an important practice exam and warned her that her career could be in danger if she didn't pass the next time. Her classmate David Sterling later noted her stressed but defiant manner after that encounter, recognizing her unwillingness to back down from an academic challenge. She ate a late lunch alone at a campus cafe, reviewing her notes, before heading to the Peabody Museum archives for an intense research session from 2 to 5:30 p.m. At 6:45 p.m., she met her boyfriend, Jim Humphreys, a fellow graduate student, for dinner at a small Italian restaurant off campus. Humphreys recounted in his initial police interview that their conversation touched on her exams and their recent dig in Iran, where they had both been sick. He admitted their relationship had been strained since their return, largely due to his distance and her intense focus on her work. An argument, though not major, left Jane feeling tired and wanting to go home early. Jane returned to 6th University Road around 8:30 p.m., accompanied by her housemate, Donald Mitchell, another anthropology graduate student who had also been at the dinner party. They parted ways, each going to their own rooms. Briefly, Jane visited with her other hallmates, Maya Sharma and Thomas Reed, a friendly couple who lived down the hall. Maya observed Jane was tired, yet still buzzing with ideas about a new theory for her exam, though she seemed somewhat distant and preoccupied. Jane declined an offer of tea, stating she simply needed rest before the big day ahead. Jane's final journal entry, written shortly before midnight on January 6th, read, "Exams tomorrow. Karlovsky is breathing down my neck, but I won't let him break me. Must clarify my thesis on ritual symbolism. A distraction this evening helped clear my head, but I need to focus now. My future depends on this." On the morning of January 7th, 1969, Donald Mitchell began his day expecting a routine study session with his friend and fellow graduate student, Jane Britton. By 9 a.m., she still hadn't appeared, unusual for someone so punctual. At first, Mitchell brushed it off, assuming Jane had overslept. But by 9:25, after repeated knocks on her door went unanswered, his concern turned into dread. Seeking reassurance, he asked another student, Thomas Reed, to check with him. Mitchell later described Jane's door as just ajar, noting that while not unusual for Jane, the deep silence was unsettling. Reed peered past Mitchell's shoulder into the dimly lit room. He later testified to the unforgettable stillness, and then the sight of her. Mitchell and Reed immediately backed out, closing the door and running to call for help. Uniformed officers and detectives, led by the seasoned Detective Sergeant Peter Sennett and his junior partner, Officer Lena Walsh, arrived within minutes. Their incident report described what they found. Female victim, approximately 23 years of age, lying on floor near bed. Blunt force trauma visible to head. Body covered with fine reddish-brown powder. Apartment undisturbed. Door unlocked. Two windows slightly open. No signs of forced entry. This initial assessment immediately raised several concerns, not least the unsettling detail of the mysterious powder. By 10 a.m., the old building was swarming with law enforcement as news of the murder spread like wildfire through the stunned academic community. Cambridge medical examiner Dr. Arthur Gaines arrived shortly after. His preliminary examination at the scene established the time of death between 11:30 p.m. Monday night and 2 a.m. Tuesday morning. Jane was dressed in a casual blouse and skirt, not sleepwear, indicating she hadn't been preparing for bed when she was attacked. Dr. Gaines noted the blunt force trauma was severe. As investigators processed the scene, they made several observations that would shape and complicate the initial investigation. Jane's wallet remained untouched in her purse with $67 inside, ruling out robbery as a motive. Her academic notes were scattered across her desk, suggesting she might have been studying when her visitor arrived. Most peculiarly, a small ancient clay shard of probable Mesopotamian origin was found carefully placed on her chest, and covering Jane's body and dusting the immediate area around her was a distinctive reddish-brown powder later identified as red ochre. This detail, the macabre post-mortem ritual, would become the most tantalizing and frustrating piece of evidence, pointing toward a killer with specialized knowledge. Detective Sergeant Sennett internally noted that the red ochre transformed it from just a murder into a message, adding, to the complexity, was the finding of evidence of recent sexual activity by Dr. Gaines within hours of Jane's death. This suggested she had been intimate with someone shortly before the murder, a person she likely knew well, given the unlocked door and two open windows, which showed no signs of being pried open or forced. The working theory coalesced. The killer was someone Jane knew and trusted enough to invite in, or at least someone who could enter her casually unlocked room without suspicion. Patrolman Sam Davies, a junior officer fresh out of the academy, voiced an uneasy thought to his senior partner, wondering if the unlocked door meant anyone could have simply walked in, given the building's reputation. His concern was politely but firmly brushed aside by a veteran detective, intent on focusing the investigation within Jane's immediate social circle. By noon, news of the murder had spread beyond 6 University Road to the wider academic and city community. Local radio stations interrupted programming, and the Boston papers quickly put the story on their front pages. Harvard University administration hastily called an emergency meeting. Dean Charles Prescott, an administrator noted for being particularly agitated, was reportedly overheard saying, "The reputation of this institution is paramount. We cannot afford any scandal, especially given Miss Britton's family ties." The phones in the university housing office rang non-stop as a secretary, Mrs. Agnes Peterson, recalled parents panicking and wanting to pull their children out. Students were crying in the hallways, feeling as if their world had suddenly shifted, and everyone looked to Harvard for answers. The reaction from the Cambridge community was equally strong. Local businesses closed early. Churches opened their doors for impromptu prayer services. The mayor appeared on local television urging calm, while promising that no resource would be spared in bringing this criminal to justice. As investigators continued working the crime scene throughout that Tuesday, they meticulously collected evidence that would eventually, decades later, prove crucial in solving the case. 2 wine glasses on a small table near Jane's desk, both partially filled yet bearing only her fingerprints, fibers from the carpet and microscopic skin samples from beneath Jane's fingernails, where she had scratched her attacker. Most importantly, the medical examiner carefully preserved a semen sample from Jane's underwear, though its true value would remain locked away by the limitations of 1969 forensics. "We're treating everything as potential evidence," Detective Sergeant Sennett told reporters at a hastily arranged press conference that evening, carefully omitting any mention of the red ochre, a detail the department chose to keep close to the vest to avoid public panic or copycat incidents. "At this stage, we have more questions than answers, but I want to assure both the university and the wider community that this case is our absolute priority," he added with an undertone that many journalists found strained. "Harvard is cooperating fully, and we have the full support of the university in our efforts." By Wednesday morning, January 8th, investigators had begun constructing a detailed timeline of Jane's final hours. meticulously piecing together witness statements, subtle campus observations, and the limited physical evidence. The investigation's first major challenge emerged when they attempted to identify who might have visited Jane that night. Her journal contained no explicit mention of expecting company, and none of her friends reported any plans for her to meet someone late. The presence of 2 recently used wine glasses, along with the evidence of recent sexual activity, strongly suggested she had willingly admitted a visitor. Detective Sergeant Sennett internally noted that the physical evidence clearly indicated an intimate visitor, but no one came forward to admit it. He mused that either the killer was a stranger who instantly gained her trust, or someone she knew well enough to invite in late who was now hiding. The second major challenge involved the building's security. University Road, despite being Harvard-owned housing, was notoriously porous. There was no sign-in log for visitors. The ground floor entrance was frequently left open, and individual room doors were often unlocked by residents. A close friend of Jane's later revealed that her room door had been broken even before she moved in, and the university had made no effort to replace or repair the lock. This was a common issue, with nearly 60% of the building's room locks reportedly non-functional. This lax environment meant that tracking who entered or exited after hours was nearly impossible. A veteran campus security guard, Mr. Howard Jenkins, conceded that students came and went as they pleased, assuming everyone was harmless and academic, and that such a problem had never occurred in his 20 years. The first substantial leads came from Jane's immediate circle. Her most recent boyfriend, Jim Humphreys, naturally became the initial focus. Their strained relationship, culminating in an argument the night before the murder, provided a classic motive. Humphreys was interrogated 3 times. His alibi, that he returned to his own apartment in another building and passed out after too much to drink, was initially shaky but eventually corroborated by his roommate, who recalled hearing Humphreys stumble in late. He was also subjected to and passed a routine polygraph examination. Phone records and other campus activities further placed him away from 6th University Road during the estimated time of death. Reluctantly, investigators ruled him out as the primary attacker. The red ochre, however, continued to mystify. Its presence pointed strongly towards someone with an understanding of ancient cultures, a detail that immediately drew suspicion towards members of Harvard's anthropology department. Professor C.C. Karl Lamberg Karlovsky, Jane's advisor, became the investigation's most compelling early suspect. Known for his imposing manner, his sometimes arrogant pronouncements, and his rumored interest in attractive female students, Karlovsky had a distinct dark aura. The academic pressure he had placed on Jane and her apparent defiance suggested a possible flashpoint. He was intensely questioned. His alibi that he was home with his wife was corroborated. Furthermore, no physical evidence, such as trace fibers or fingerprints other than Jane's on the wine glasses, could connect him directly to the scene of the murder. Despite lingering whispers and the academic community's quiet speculation, the official case against Karlovsky collapsed. Detective Sergeant Sennett, frustrated, penned a note in his file acknowledging Karlovsky's difficult nature, but confirmed his alibi and the troubling lack of a direct link, yet still found the red ochre too specific, pointing towards one of their own. A junior reporter for the Harvard Crimson, Rachel Porter, attempted to pursue leads about Karlovsky's past interactions with female students, but found herself repeatedly stonewalled by the university administration. She later reflected on the peculiar omission that Karlovsky, despite strong suspicions, was never formally asked to undergo a polygraph test, striking her as a deliberate sidestepping. The investigation then widened. Another graduate student in anthropology, Mike Gramley, who knew Jane and had once had tea with her, was interviewed. He was an intense figure known for his deep immersion in archaeological theory. His alibi for the night of the murder was that he was studying late at the Widener Library, corroborated by a librarian's sign-out sheet and a fellow student who saw him there until closing. Similarly, Professor Lee Parsons, an anthropology professor who had recently joined Harvard on the promise of running the Peabody Museum, was questioned due to his extensive access to the museum's collections, including archaeological materials like red ochre. Parsons claimed he was home with a severe flu, a detail his wife initially confirmed, though later, under more intense questioning, she admitted she had been sleeping heavily due to medication, and couldn't definitively confirm his presence for the entire window of Jane's death. Still, without any physical evidence to connect him, he too was eventually cleared. By late January, all immediate suspects from Jane's academic and social circles had been investigated and officially cleared through alibis or lack of direct physical evidence. The initial forensic analysis, severely constrained by 1969 technology, yielded minimal results. The wine glasses, though suggesting a visitor, only bore Jane's fingerprints. Any others had been meticulously wiped clean or were too smudged to identify. Fibers collected from the carpet near the body were generic and couldn't be definitively matched to any suspect. The semen sample, while preserved, was a mystery science couldn't yet solve. Medical examiner Dr. Gaines would lament years later that they had the biological evidence, the key, right there, but it was like a locked vault without the combination. Detective Sergeant Sennett confided to his senior officer, Lieutenant William Hayes, in a memo dated February 15, 1969, that they were dealing with either incredible luck or calculated precision. He surmised this was not a crime of opportunity or passion by a stranger, but that someone had specifically targeted Jane, someone comfortable enough in her presence for intimacy, methodical enough to clean up, and savvy enough to enter and exit undetected. However, even as Sennett sought answers, the pressure from the university administration mounted. Dean Charles Prescott, acting on subtle directives from powerful university trustees like Mr. Robert A. Linton, began to express concerns about the prolonged nature of the investigation. A university security consultant, Dr. Elias Thorne, was brought in, ostensibly to review security but effectively to run interference. The message was clear. Harvard wanted this solved, or at least out of the headlines. As Jane's body was released to her family for funeral services the following week, investigators found themselves stalled. For the first time, with no definitive eyewitnesses, no clear motive beyond speculation, and a crime scene that raised more questions than answers, detectives found themselves chasing shadows. The funeral in Radnor, Pennsylvania, drew hundreds of mourners, including dozens of Harvard classmates and faculty. Her father, J. Boyd Britton, stoic throughout the service, broke down only when his daughter's casket was lowered into the ground. "We demand justice for our daughter," Ruth Britton told reporters afterward, her voice unwavering despite her tear-streaked face. "Someone out there knows what happened to Jane. We beg you to come forward." What neither the grieving family nor the determined investigators could have imagined that day was that justice would take half a century to arrive, or that the key to solving the case was already in their possession, preserved in an evidence box that would sit untouched for decades, waiting for science to catch up to a killer who walked freely. Among them, a killer whose identity might be more convenient than truthful. The Britton family returned to their Radnor home after Jane's funeral, to find it filled with the suffocating weight of unanswered questions. J. Boyd Britton, once known for his sharp intellect and steady composure, began to withdraw from his colleagues. He spent long hours alone in his study, often surrounded by Jane's old notebooks and drafts of her thesis, unable to bring himself to file them away. Once a commanding lecturer, he grew hesitant and distracted, his voice faltering whenever her name appeared in academic discussions. Ruth, who had long been a spirited presence in local educational and charity circles, could no longer bring herself to host gatherings or attend social events. She avoided Harvard-related functions entirely, finding the institution's silence unbearable. Friends recalled how she would sit by the kitchen window for hours, her hands clasped around a cold cup of tea, staring out as if waiting for something or someone to return. Their son, Boyd Jr., only 14 at the time, later remembered the house as unbearably still. "It wasn't just quiet," he said decades later. "It was as if the air itself had stopped moving." For the Brittons, grief slowly hardened into determination. When the active investigation was officially suspended in September 1969, J. Boyd began keeping meticulous records. Every conversation with law enforcement, every fleeting newspaper article, every rumor that drifted from Harvard. By the time of his passing in 1998, those files filled several shelves in his study, a father's desperate attempt to impose order on a world shattered by chaos. Meanwhile, the university's handling of Jane's death sparked outrage. As the press began publishing details about broken locks, lax security, and ignored maintenance requests, students and faculty organized a series of campus demonstrations demanding accountability. Parents of Harvard students joined the protest, accusing the administration of negligence. Under mounting pressure, University President Nathan M. Pusey held an emergency press conference, offering condolences to the Britton family and promising immediate reforms. Within weeks, door locks were replaced across all Harvard-owned housing, and a new security office was established. Though many, including Ruth, viewed the gestures as too little, too late. Ruth channeled her grief into quiet but persistent advocacy, writing letters to university trustees and state legislators urging transparency and systemic reform. Harvard has the resources to protect its students, she wrote in one of her letters, but perhaps not yet the conscience. As the years passed, the Brittons' pursuit of justice became generational. Boyd Britton, Jr., shaped by loss, abandoned his early interest in finance and turned to journalism. He rose to prominence as an investigative reporter, advocating for cold case victims and their families. Though professional ethics prevented him from covering his sister's case directly, he carried Jane's files wherever he moved. In a rare 1990 conference on unsolved crimes, he said simply that he could never bring his sister back, but he could make sure her silence was never forgotten, and that the institutions that failed her were held to account. Media attention ebbed and flowed over the years, flaring up around anniversaries. The 5th anniversary in 1974 brought a Boston Globe feature titled The Harvard Mystery 5 Years On. A decade later, in 1979, a local television documentary revisited the case with interviews from investigators and Jane's grieving parents. Both accounts echoed the same refrain: no forced entry, likely a known assailant, implicitly steering attention away from Harvard's potential role. The case files themselves endured their own journey, mirroring the investigation's slow decay and improbable preservation. They were first stored in the active case room, later moved to basement archives in 1970, and then to a county records facility in 1982. During a severe flood in 1997, a clerk named Brenda Miller reportedly carried the Britton evidence boxes to higher ground on her shoulders, refusing to let them be damaged. Her act of quiet devotion, unnoticed at the time, would prove vital decades later. By the 20th anniversary in 1989, Jane's murder had evolved from recent tragedy to campus legend, whispered among students. A Harvard Crimson retrospective that year, riddled with small factual errors, prompted a sharply worded letter from Ruth Britton, reminding readers that her daughter's death was not folklore, but our ongoing nightmare, and Harvard's continued silence only deepens it. Jane's case, though technically open, gradually faded into the background as new crimes claimed attention. Detective Sergeant Peter Sennett, who had led the original investigation, refused to let it go. Every January 7th, he requested to review the file, a quiet ritual he maintained until his retirement in 1993. His former superior, Lieutenant William Hayes, later told interviewers in 2005 that Sennett had been haunted by the Britton case, spreading the files out on his desk year after year, hoping for something new, ensuring Jane would not be forgotten even when the department and Harvard seemed eager to move on. The 25th anniversary in 1994 coincided with the emergence of DNA technology, sparking cautious hope. Commander Thomas Brennan, once a rookie officer on the case, authorized the first official cold case review in 1996. For 6 weeks, a small team re-examined every item of evidence and re-interviewed surviving witnesses. Though no arrest followed, the process led to modern repackaging of key exhibits. The crucial semen sample from Jane's underwear was transferred to sterile containers and refrigerated under the supervision of forensic technician Dr. Elena Rodriguez, who remarked that if viable DNA remained, we've given it the best chance of survival. They had unknowingly preserved the key that science would one day use to unlock the vault. The first actual DNA testing of evidence from Jane's case occurred in 1998, but the technology was still in its infancy. The initial tests consumed valuable sample material while yielding inconclusive results, a devastating setback that nearly destroyed the biological evidence before it could be analyzed. With more advanced techniques, we were ahead of the science. Commander Brennan admitted in a press conference announcing the disappointing results. But we've preserved what remains for future testing. This case will be solved, It's just a matter of when the technology catches up to our determination and when Harvard truly commits to transparency. By the 30th anniversary in 1999, the investigation had been officially reviewed 5 times. Each review incorporated new forensic techniques as they became available. Fingerprints were run through automated identification systems. Fibers were analyzed using electron microscopes. Witness statements were evaluated using statement analysis protocols that didn't exist in 1969. The 40th anniversary in 2009 marked a turning point in how the case was perceived by both the public and law enforcement. What had once been discussed as a tragedy that might be solved someday was increasingly viewed as a cold case that might never be resolved, haunted by the specter of powerful institutions. The Boston Globe's anniversary coverage that year carried the somber headline, "4 decades later, has justice for Jane Britton become impossible?" Ruth Britton, then 90 and in failing health, gave what many assumed would be her final interview about her daughter's case. "I've accepted that I may not live to see Jane's killer brought to justice," she told the newspaper. "But I believe that day will come. Science advances. People's consciences trouble them as they age. Secrets become harder to keep. Someone knows something, and someday that knowledge will come to light, even if it implicates those who tried to bury the truth." What Ruth could not have known was that the breakthrough was already beginning to take shape through a revolutionary approach to DNA analysis that would transform cold case investigations worldwide, an approach championed by a tenacious former Harvard student. In 2009, exactly 40 years after Jane Britton's unsolved murder, a whispered secret made the rounds at Harvard, catching the ear of a sophomore named Becky Cooper. The tale spoke of a professor who had beaten his student to death, then sprinkled red ochre dust on her body in a macabre post-mortem ritual. The motive, she was told, involved a lover's quarrel, a professor seducing his victim, then killing her to keep their affair hidden. No one ever said the name outright, at least not at first. But in hushed tones over coffee in the yard or in late-night dorm conversations, the same name would eventually surface, heavy with accusation: Professor C.C. Karl Lamberg Karlofsky. He still walked those halls, tall, imperious, wrapped in his signature cape, teaching the next generation of students as if nothing had ever happened. A tenured scholar in Harvard's elite anthropology department, he had been Jane Britton's faculty advisor, the man who once failed her general exam, criticized her work in Iran, and, if the whispers were to be believed, carried a secret darker than any burial mound he had ever studied. The story lodged itself in Cooper's mind. She read up on the sensational case, which had received front-page coverage in the Boston Post and other local papers before swiftly drying up. Many believed then, and continued to whisper decades later, that Cambridge police had botched the investigation and Harvard, ever protective of its image, had muzzled the press. In 2012, Cooper, now a determined alumna, began attending classes led by the then 74-year-old Professor Karlofsky. He was an imposing figure, sometimes roaming the halls in a cape. Known to be pompous and mercurial, a compelling suspect indeed. Cooper could find no concrete evidence that Karlofsky and Britton ever slept together. While a PhD student, Peter Rodman, had recalled hearing a rumor that Jane had threatened one member of her general's committee that she would expose the affair they had been having if she didn't pass, and that Karlofsky was the professor at the heart of this rumor, it remained just that, a rumor. Karlofsky himself, in a later conversation with Cooper, seemed strangely unbothered by the decades of suspicion, which only enhanced his intimidating aura. Undeterred, Cooper pursued other leads. She looked into Jane's boyfriend, Jim Humphreys, whose relationship with Jane had been strained. She also considered Mike Gramley, another Harvard graduate student in anthropology who knew Jane. Gramley, a passionate but intense individual, became more suspect when it was revealed he had been investigated for another female student's mysterious disappearance 7 years after Jane's murder, Anne Abraham, in Labrador, Canada. Though Abraham's body was never found, her parents believed foul play. Gramley, however, denied any affair with Jane, and even became passionately involved in trying to solve her murder, peppering the police with requests for information. As Gramley began to fade as a primary suspect for Cooper, he gave her a tantalizing new clue. He had found a box in storage in a lab at the Peabody Museum filled with red ochre, with one missing handful. Gramley believed the box belonged to the museum's lab director at the time, Professor Lee Parsons, who was known to have spent at least one evening alone with Jane. And so it was that Cooper, with the unwavering support of Boyd Britton Jr., began to focus on Professor Lee Parsons. Parsons, who came to Harvard in 1968, had battled personal demons after leaving the university. Having never received the promotion he was promised, he had come out as gay, drank heavily, and was prone to raging outbursts. His close friend Stephen Loring recounted Parsons revealing during a later dig in Guatemala that he'd been accused of murder. Loring expressed his comfort with Parsons as the culprit when speaking to Cooper. Parsons, however, was now dead, having succumbed to AIDS in 1996. Cooper, a meticulous researcher, scoured every interview Parsons and others gave to Cambridge police. Cooper demanded the release of the entire case file, but the Cambridge Police Department, still protective of its original investigation and reputation, refused, citing ongoing investigations. With Boyd Britton Jr.'s cooperation, Cooper obtained portions of Jane's original case files, photocopies of police reports, coroner notes, and correspondence preserved by the Britton family. She also reviewed Jane's personal journals and photographs, which Boyd Jr. reluctantly shared for the first time since his parents' deaths. Her relentless investigation eventually caught the attention of the Boston Globe's vaunted Spotlight team, who decided to do a story with Cooper agreeing to help them. The mounting public pressure, amplified by the Globe's imminent exposé, finally forced Cambridge police to acknowledge something they had quietly kept off the record for decades. Evidence from the crime scene still existed. Among the preserved materials was a biological sample, a semen trace recovered from Jane's clothing, long considered too degraded to yield results. Investigators had doubted for years that it would ever matter, but the technological landscape was rapidly changing. By 2018, genetic genealogy, the revolutionary technique of using commercial DNA databases to identify criminal suspects through family connections, had emerged as a powerful new tool in cold case investigations. The high-profile arrest of the Golden State Killer that April, solving crimes dating back to the 1970s, sent shockwaves through both the law enforcement community and the public consciousness. In Cambridge, these developments were watched with particular interest by Sergeant Amelia Clark, a dedicated cold case investigator who had inherited the Britton case file in 2015. Commander Brennan, now retired but still deeply invested personally, advised her Sergeant Clark, a meticulous investigator with specialized training in cold case methodology, spent her first 3 years on the case digitizing all records and evidence documentation, creating the first comprehensive electronic database of the investigation. Clark explained in a department memo requesting funding for advanced DNA testing in late 2018 that the Britton case had never been about a lack of evidence, but their inability to connect it to a specific individual, especially with the institutional pressures that plagued the original investigation. She believed the genetic genealogy techniques that identified the Golden State Killer could be their path to finally bringing Jane's killer to justice and perhaps expose some uncomfortable truths. Her request was approved in January 2019, setting in motion the final chapter of a story that had begun nearly 5 decades earlier. On February 12, 2019, Sergeant Amelia Clark carefully sealed the evidence package containing the semen sample from Jane Britton's underwear. The package, about the size of a small notebook, but treated with the reverence of a sacred artifact, represented the last best hope for solving a case that had haunted generations of investigators and the Britton family. Clark later recalled thinking, "This is it," believing that either it would work or they would have to accept that Jane's case might never be solved in a truly satisfying way. The samples were bound for Parabon Nanolabs in Virginia, one of a handful of private laboratories specializing in genetic genealogy for law enforcement. This revolutionary approach to DNA analysis had emerged from an unexpected convergence of recreational ancestry testing, big data analytics, and traditional forensic science. Unlike conventional DNA testing that requires a direct match in criminal databases, genetic genealogy could identify suspects through their distant relatives, people who had voluntarily submitted DNA to commercial ancestry services for entirely different purposes. The technique had already solved dozens of cold cases nationwide since its first successful application in 2018, many dating back decades. Dr. Eleonora Wright, the forensic genetic genealogist assigned to Jane's case, explained the difference. Traditional DNA analysis was like finding someone by exact address, while genetic genealogy was like locating them by finding their cousins and then deducing their likely residence from those family connections, exponentially expanding search capabilities. The initial comparison yielded no direct matches but identified 19 individuals who shared enough genetic markers with the crime scene DNA to be distant relatives of the killer. Dr. Wright clarified that these were not close relatives but primarily third and fourth cousins who likely had never met the perpetrator but shared great-great-grandparents. The team had constructed family trees containing over 2,800 individuals across 6 generations. They then began narrowing the field by applying filters based on what was known about the killer. Male, likely between 18 to 40 years old in 1969, and with some connection to the Cambridge-Boston area. This filtering process reduced the pool to 42 potential suspects. Further, refinement based on geographical location during the time of the murder and known criminal history further narrowed the list to just 8 men who were in the right place, at the right time with the right genetic connections. Sergeant Clark received the short list on April 2, 2019. She recalled expecting to see a list of names she had never encountered before, but instead found herself staring at names that resonated with forgotten corners of the criminal justice system and a profile that starkly conflicted with the initial assumptions of the case. Third on the list was Michael Sumter. A quick search of the digitized case files revealed that Sumter had no direct connection to Harvard or Jane Britton. He was known to Cambridge and Boston police, however, as a career criminal with a history of violent offenses, including serial rape and murder, who stalked and attacked young women in the Boston area. He had been a suspect in the 1972 murder of a 23-year-old brunette who resembled Jane Sumter, however was now deceased, having died in prison in 2000. The official working theory quickly emerged. Sumter, out on parole in January 1969, had been watching Jane. When she entered her apartment, he climbed up a fire escape, found an open window, entered, sexually assaulted, and killed her. It was a narrative that neatly fit a known deceased serial killer but left critical questions unanswered. Becky Cooper, whose own investigative work had helped push the case forward, felt a growing sense of unease. Sumter's DNA didn't explain the red ochre, the ritualistic detail that had haunted the case for decades. And how could a violent entry have occurred without witnesses or disturbance, given the intimate scene implied by the wine glasses and the initial no forced entry assessment? Before the public announcement, Sergeant Clark needed to confirm the genetic connection beyond doubt. Given Sumter's death, standard covert collection was impossible. However, the State Crime Laboratory retained a DNA sample from Sumter related to his later convictions. The results came back on April 7th. The DNA from Michael Sumter's archived sample matched the DNA from Jane Britton's underwear with a probability of 99.998% after 48 years. Jane Britton's killer officially had a name. Clark remembered sitting at her desk, staring at the report, feeling a strange mix of elation and horror. Elation because they finally had an answer, and horror because of how many questions still remained, and the troubling implications of such a convenient resolution for the department's past failures. The horror stemmed not just from the identification but from the stark contrast between the long-held known assailant theory driven by the red ochre and the revelation of a stranger, a career criminal, a man who in death could not speak. News of Michael Sumter's identification as Jane Britton's killer spread through Cambridge with the speed and force of a shockwave. By noon on April 7th, every local news outlet had broken the story. The announcement, delivered by the Cambridge District Attorney's Office alongside the Chief of Police, framed the closure as a triumph of modern forensics finally bringing justice to a decades-old mystery. The narrative was simple and definitive. A predatory serial criminal, previously unknown to Jane, had seized an opportunity presented by lax security. However, for many, the official narrative created a profound cognitive dissonance, immediately igniting the very skepticism that had simmered for 50 years. Former investigators, academics, and Jane's surviving family wrestled with the convenient neatness of the conclusion against the persistent, unsettling questions. Commander Brennan, now fully retired, acknowledged the official closure but privately expressed his unease, noting that while Sumter was a monster, a random monster climbing a fire escape and then leaving a ritualistic archaeological symbol on the body doesn't quite fit the picture we always had, or the specific details of that scene. Becky Cooper, who had dedicated a decade to the case, found herself at the epicenter of this conflict. The DA's version made the ending seem neat and definitive, but the story was too big at this point for any clear resolution, she later mused. She pointed to the gaping holes. The DNA match didn't explain the red ochre. However, and how could he have done it without anyone seeing him or hearing what happened if it was a struggle with a stranger? All we know for sure is Michael Sumter had sex with her. That still doesn't prove who did the murder. The original police assessment of no forced entry, coupled with the apparent consensual intimacy preceding the death, clashed sharply with Sumter's known modus operandi as a violent serial rapist and killer. The horror of Sumter's identification stemmed not just from the resolution of a cold case, but from the stark contrast between his profile and the deeply held convictions of many involved in the original investigation. The long-standing belief was that the red ochre and the intimate scene pointed to someone Jane knew well, likely an academic. Sumter, a career criminal with no ties to Harvard's anthropology department, fundamentally challenged this, yet he was deceased, making a public trial and the rigorous cross-examination of evidence impossible. This, for many, was the most troubling convenience. It feels like they picked the easiest answer, not necessarily the truest, a retired Cambridge detective. Daniel Albright, who had worked under Sennett in the 70s, anonymously told the Boston Globe, "A dead serial killer can't talk. A dead serial killer doesn't implicate the university or police failures." The community grappled with these revelations. Impromptu memorials appeared at 6 University Road, with flowers laid by students who only knew Jane as a historical figure, now brought into sharp, tragic focus. Simultaneously, heated debates erupted in campus forums and local coffee shops. Many struggled to reconcile the initial theories of an insider with the scientific identification of a brutal outsider. The news spurred a renewed, biting criticism of Harvard's historical response. Students questioned how such a Harvard-owned building could have such abysmal security, especially given Jane's father's prominent role at Radcliffe. Dean Charles Prescott, the administrator who had expressed agitation about Harvard's reputation in 1969, had long since retired and passed away. However, his successor, Dean Stephen R. Halberg, issued a formal apology on behalf of the university, acknowledging the profound failures in campus security and institutional transparency that contributed to the decades of uncertainty surrounding Miss Britton's tragic death. This apology, a stark contrast to Harvard's initial response, was clearly an attempt to mend its image in the face of renewed public and media scrutiny. For the Britton family, Sumter's identification brought a complex mixture of emotions. Ruth Britton, now 94 and in assisted living, received the news from Sergeant Clark personally. Clark recalled that Ruth simply nodded calmly, stating, "An answer. Not the one I expected, but an answer." It was a simple statement of fact, devoid of triumph or excessive emotion from a woman who had never stopped believing justice would come, even if incomplete. Boyd Britton Jr., now in his early 60s and a respected investigative journalist, became the family's public voice. He continued to advocate for a deeper understanding of the case, focusing his journalistic efforts on exposing the systemic issues that he believed allowed the true narrative to be obscured for so long. He penned a scathing op-ed piece in a national newspaper titled "The Convenient Killer," arguing that while Sumter was undeniably a violent man, the rush to declare the case fully solved ignored the unique ritualistic elements and the implications of the unlocked door scenario, effectively absolving other potential players or institutional negligence. "My sister's case became a casualty of Harvard's reputation and the police department's need for a clean solve," he wrote. "The DNA gave them a name, but it didn't give us the whole truth. It didn't explain the ochre. It didn't explain why a violent stranger left the scene without a struggle or signs of forced entry. It allowed the uncomfortable questions to be buried with a convenient answer. With Michael Sumter identified and already deceased, there was no trial, The Cambridge District Attorney's Office formally closed the case on April 15, 2019, classifying it as solved through DNA evidence. The announcement marked the end of an official investigation that had spanned 5 decades, but for many it did not bring the expected sense of closure, only a renewed focus on lingering ambiguities and institutional accountability. The reaction from the academic and local community was swift and varied. Harvard University moved swiftly to distance itself from the historical controversy, yet also to publicly acknowledge its past failings. President Lawrence S. Bacow announced the establishment of the Jane Britton Fellowship in Archaeological Ethics, a scholarship intended to promote ethical conduct in academic research and mentorship, as well as a formal commitment to ongoing campus safety improvements. The Peabody Museum, where Jane had conducted so much of her research, also launched a public lecture series titled Unearthing Truths, Archaeology and Society, reflecting on the complex intersection of academic pursuits and real-world consequences. The Cambridge Police Department, under new leadership, initiated an internal review of the 1969 investigation, acknowledging that historical limitations and oversight procedures may have impacted the thoroughness of the original efforts. While not explicitly admitting to a botched investigation or cover-up, the statement allowed for the interpretation that critical leads or alternative theories may have been prematurely dismissed. Sergeant Amelia Clark, the cold case investigator who ultimately identified Sumter, was praised for her tenacity, but even she found herself defending the official narrative against the persistent questions from the media, skillfully navigating interviews without undermining her department, while also acknowledging the remaining complexities. Clark stated in a prominent interview with the Boston Globe that they followed the science, noting the DNA definitively linked Sumter to Jane Britton. She acknowledged that what led him to the apartment, the specifics of the interaction, and the meaning of the red ochre were questions a deceased suspect could not answer, but affirmed they had identified the perpetrator of the sexual assault and murder. This careful phrasing, separating the DNA match from the ritualistic details, was noted by many, including Boyd Britton Jr. In the months following the identification, Jane's case transformed from an unsolved mystery to a complex teaching tool. The FBI added it to their training curriculum as an example of how genetic genealogy could resolve decades-old cases while also using it as a case study for the persistent challenges of unresolved motives and inconsistent evidence. Forensic science programs incorporated it into discussions about evidence preservation and the responsible interpretation of DNA findings, especially when other details remain unexplained. Law enforcement agencies nationwide reviewed their own cold case files with renewed hope, but also with a critical eye towards re-evaluating long-held assumptions. For Becky Cooper, the resolution of the case brought neither triumph nor full closure. In interviews following the DNA announcement, she admitted struggling to reconcile her years of investigation and the haunting possibility of institutional complicity with the final identification of a long-dead stranger. If people need someone to blame, she told the Boston Globe, then perhaps the only person left is already dead. It was a statement both resigned and defiant, acknowledging that while the science had spoken, the larger human truths, the power, privilege, and silence that shadowed Jane's story, remained uncomfortably alive. Jane Marie Britton's legacy extended beyond her tragic death to include the scientific progress her case inspired, the advocacy her brother pursued, and the uncomfortable questions it continued to pose about justice, reputation, and truth. On the first anniversary of Sumter's identification, Ruth Britton passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 95. Her obituary, written by Boyd Jr., noted that she died having witnessed her daughter's killer identified but left behind a son who continued to seek the fuller truth behind the convenient answer. Her life's mission for Jane's justice was completed, yet the complete story remained elusive, a permanent shadow woven into the fabric of Harvard and Cambridge history.